Hello, welcome everyone. Delighted that you could join us this morning. It's great to have you all here. My name is Am Johal. I'm director of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. We're both at the Woodwards building and for the past 5 years have had a space on the second floor and other SFU spaces that have been here since January of 2020. We're partnered today with the BC Co-op Association and the Jim Green Foundation. Elvie and Thomas will introduce themselves in a little bit. Also wanted to begin by recognizing that we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I think really important to not just recognize that, but the important work of decolonization that all organizations are responsible for, and that we take that work seriously today and going into the future. I wanted to just make some initial remarks as well. That we have with us that are going to be joining us a bit later, Stefano and Vera Zamagni from the University of Bologna. A number of you in the room. If I could just see by a show of hands, how many of you have been to Bologna with Vancity? Yeah, about just under half of you here. And I think it was really important for us to try to bring that conversation about the relationship between the social economy and co-ops in BC to the great work that's been done in relationship with the University of Bologna. Stefano and Vera have been here to Vancouver. Others like Pierluigi Sacco have been here as well over the years. And I think it's important to also note that 312 Main Street, this building that we're in right now, former police station from the early 50s up until 2011, the vision that Jim Green had for it, came out of the Pride Center in the 90s, trying to do local employment work through government agencies was a real challenge, and trying to come up with a different model. The other inspiration came out of the Center for Social Innovation in Toronto. And the third piece of that, which I think challenges with growing this project, came out of Bologna and the cooperative sector, and trying to have a vision of this building in terms of having people working in social and environmental change work that had a connection back to that work. Just before I introduce Elvie and Thomas, just to get the room warmed up a little bit, I'm just going to ask you to take 1 minute to look across the room to somebody you don't know and go over and introduce yourselves to them just for 1 minute, if you could. Okay, I ask that you wrap up in 30 seconds. Come on back, Elvie. We're going to get started shortly here. Yeah. And as many of you know, Bob Williams was going to be joining us this morning. He wasn't feeling well today, so unfortunately he won't be able to join us as part of the program, but we are recording this and we'll be sharing it with him. And I'm going to pass this over to Elvie Del Bianco from the BC Co-op Association and Thomas Bevan from the Jim Green Foundation to introduce yourselves and kick us off.
Hello, everyone. Is the mic working? I'm Thomas Bevan. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for making the time this morning. I'm with the Jim Green Foundation. I'm a close friend of Bob Williams, and I'm a planner, an urban planner. I met Bob while I was at SCARP, about the School of Community and Regional Planning, about 10 years ago. And Bob actually went to that school too, 50 years ago. And so we were kindred spirits, and we've been working on projects ever since. We worked on this building together, and over COVID, I helped Bob write his memoirs. So those are available outside for people at the end, and I have to say a little plug. I think it's a wonderful book, but it goes into the cooperative journey that Bob Williams had over his career and thinking about this province, resources, planning. So would really recommend it. Also, other reading materials for everyone is a paper that's on the table, and we'll be talking about some of the most salient points, but those are some of Bob's reflections on his experience in Bologna and with Professor Zamagni, and we'll get to that shortly. Elvie.
Am's been at the mic. Good morning. I'm Elvito Bianco. I'm the Director for Cooperative and Government Relations at the BC Co-op Association. And I have a long history with Emilia-Romagna and the cooperative movement there. And we're here to sort of reflect on that long relationship and the benefits that it's provided us to date and where we see it going in the future. I wanted to give you a little history about the program, put it into some context. And Bob Williams was instrumental in getting this started, and it dates back to Vancity creating or contemplating the creation of a subsidiary that eventually came to be called Vancity Capital Corp. And Bob was heavily involved in this, and in his mind, he saw it as a kind of regional development bank, something that would be focused not on traditional banking, but local economic development, community economic development. And sort of speaking to colleagues about models by which the Capital Corp could create itself. And it was colleagues at Shorebank in Chicago, sadly no longer with us, but at the time doing very similar kind of work. And based on what Bob was, his aspirations suggested, he really should be looking at what's going on in Emilia-Romagna. And so started nosing about, and I believe he ran into some other no-goodniks there, like John Ristakis, the former executive director of the BCCA, who was also nosing around Emilia-Romagna, and they hit on this idea of a study tour. And the program was launched in earnest in 2002 with a 5-week trip to Emilia-Romagna, if you can believe that. 5 weeks in Italy, with weekends off for hiking up in the Dolomites and these kinds of things. That proved to be a bit onerous for people. People have a hard time getting away for 5 weeks, and the program evolved over time. But really, the critical component there was this connection made with Stefano and Vera Zamagni at the University of Bologna. I think we've shared the bios for our colleagues. Yeah, I'd take the rest of the morning reading them to you, and so I won't. But I mean, Stefano, in essence, is the world's leading academic in cooperative economics. Vera is Italy's leading economic historian, and they have been tremendous partners on this journey in terms of trying to understand what is happening in Emilia-Romagna. And that was the objective of the tour. What are they doing over there, and how can we apply it within our own context? So, what are they doing? They're practicing a different, more humane economics. And that is really centered on the presence of a very vibrant cooperative economy. There are some circa 5,000 co-ops in Emilia-Romagna. in terms of the overall number of businesses, that represents something like 1.5%. And usually when we would do the study tour, people would say, well, why are we going to see a small sample of what's going on there in terms of their economy? Well, it is 1.5% of all the incorporated businesses, but they account for something like 15% of the total employment and 20 to 25% of the GDP for the region. And the benefits that we see stem from that disproportionate presence within their economy. That after the financial crisis, typically corporated businesses are pursuing what we come to be familiar activity, cutting jobs. We see employment in the cooperative movement go up during that period of time. And we see co-op creation going up in the immediate years following the financial crisis. So when corporations are cutting in order to save costs, co-ops are investing into their local economy. And the net effect of that, and we saw that on the tours, and I should note, my involvement with this program started in 2004 when I had reached out to Bob, who I'd known from many years previous, and he had said to me, back when I was a kid, I was an intern at the legislature in Victoria, and he says, look kid, if you're ever looking for a job, you should give me a call. And I gave him a call like 12 years later and said, yeah, I'm looking for something interesting. And he said, well, what are you doing this summer? We're going to go to Italy. Yeah, great. And curiously enough, when my family is from northern Italy, and I told him I was going to do this work, my dad said, well, what are you doing over there? And I said, well, we're going to go study co-ops, this thing, co-ops. What's the big deal? We're a member of the wine co-op. We're a member of the grain co-op. I'm a third generation cooperator, had no idea. And that was my own personal awakening on this trip in terms of this kind of business entity and how it often operates below the radar. And it's something that we don't appreciate enough in terms of the social and economic impact that it has. And certainly the economic impact is clear in terms of the kind of the effect that the co-op sector had on the Emilian economy following the financial crisis. It essentially acted as a giant cushion for the economy. Big co-ops in communities were not letting go of people if they could avoid it, recognizing that would create a social problem within their own community and that would aggravate the kind of economic hardship that they would have, and so they wouldn't let people go. We visited just at the brink of the crisis, just as the crisis was really starting to take hold one year, we visited a ceramics tile workers cooperative in Imola called Ceramica di Imola. They had 1,400 people working there, 400 of which were members and the rest were employees. As a result of the financial crisis, they found themselves 400 FTEs over budget. There was also some competition pressures from Asia and from South America. So the response would be to cut those 400 jobs. And instead this co-op decided that, they could let go of 400 non-members. That would be the solution. Instead, everyone, members and employees alike, took reduced pay and reduced hours and didn't let anybody go. Those that wanted to retire, they helped them retire. I had the chance to go back and visit them again in 2018 or 2019, now that we're out of the financial crisis. And they were back on their feet. They didn't let anybody go. Some people took retirement. There was no adverse effect caused by them in their local community as a result of this work. You extrapolate that to the sector as a whole, and you can start to get a sense of where some of the kind of economic benefits are coming from this. But then there's an impact beyond that. Co-ops in our own jurisdiction, as much as it pains me to say this, we're still kind of marginal to the way our economy is organized. And I don't think that's the case in Emilia-Romagna, although, again, they're comprises 1.5% of the businesses, but they are central to the way the economy is organized. Others outside of the cooperative movement seem to have stolen pages from the cooperative playbook in terms of the way they organize themselves. So this is an economy of small and medium-sized enterprises. many small businesses, and they have a support system that looks a lot like the cooperative federations. There are essentially co-ops of small and medium-sized enterprises that provide them with all the backroom services that that small businesses don't want to worry about: accounting, payroll, HR, all these kinds of things. And then we see cooperation in industrial districts involving all kinds of organizations, including large corporations or larger corporations. And we see competitors cooperating amongst themselves in order to achieve their common goals. So this is a highly competitive economy. It is one of the higher functioning economies in Italy, but it also has this redistributive element built into the sector, and a high degree of competition and cooperation kind of coexisting at the same time. And this is, this I think is a reflection of, if you look in Bob's paper, and I encourage you to do that, this is something he wrote years ago, but updated for this event. And you look at, and very much inspired by the lessons of Stefano and Vera Zamagni, if you look at the triangle in that paper, and this conceptualization of our society as having these kinds of three components. One being the exchange of equivalents, which is the market. The other one being the public component, the redistributive element, and the third one being civil society. And that there are relationships on each side of this, image, this triangle. In the exchange of equivalents, that's the market. When you enter the market, you enter into contracts every time you acquire a good or service. You're going to go to a local coffee shop. You're going to order a coffee. You've now entered into a contract. You have to hand over something, and somebody gives you back. So relationships in that side of the triangle are equal to the extent that you have money to expend, right? And the relationships are obligatory. Then we have this redistributive function, which is public institutions, our governments that have healthcare programs and others that sort of provide for those that don't have, or philanthropic organizations that redistribute from those that have plenty to those that need more. And there are relationships here too, only these ones tend to be one-sided. Those that have give to those that don't. And as necessary as this kind of redistributive function is, it's not great for the people on the receiving end, because you're always in the place, it's a humiliation over time to always be in the receiving end and not having the opportunity to express yourself within those kinds of relationships. And the third side, which I think we don't talk about this very much in our context at all, is this idea of civil society and this idea of reciprocal relationships, which are, like the exchange of equivalents, equal, but they're not obligatory. So I'm going to help Patrick because his car broke down on the side of the road, and I'm going to do so not because I'm going to expect some kind of return for doing that, but because I can and I choose to do that. And maybe Patrick will help somebody else who helps somebody else who helps somebody else, and maybe that comes back to me or not. I have the power in that relationship to contribute by choice. And the Zamagnis will agree with that. It's the co-op where these kinds of expressions of reciprocity have their best manifestation, right? Where groups of people who don't know each other come together and support each other, and over time that build trust as a result of those kinds of exchanges. And over time, that kind of accumulation of trust becomes social capital, which has a significant economic value in itself. As Stefano's told us many times, the market, the exchange of equivalents, does not generate social capital, but it does consume it. So where are we producing it if the market is consuming it? And I think this is where This is where I start to hand it off. I'm looking at my clock at 9:25, right? I'm just trying to keep to the schedule. I don't want to get my colleagues upset at me. But this is, I think, what we've learned in Emilia-Romagna is a new language. I don't mean Italian, but a new language of cooperative economics that is much more people-focused, that understands the bigger kind of drivers in terms of what we need for sustainable economy, communities, that goes beyond the strictly economic. And we see the challenges that's producing within our own community. And that if we are to see some of the social and economic benefits that they have in Emilia-Romagna, that we need to consider not only that language, but some of the mechanisms in order to generate those kinds of possibilities. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn the podium, the mic over to, I believe Stefano is speaking first. And I'm happy that I do that happily, to know that this connection that has been so fruitful for Vancity Credit Union in terms of supporting the study tour for almost 20 years. And as we will talk about later when we have the panel of some around some of the local projects that we're pursuing, I think you'll see how the lessons that we have learned in Emilia-Romagna are starting to manifest themselves here in our own community. But I think we'll get much more in-depth understanding of some of these things by my turning it over to Stefano, and that's what I will do now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helmi, and good morning, everybody. It's a real pity for me that I cannot see your face, but as you know, these are the requirements of the new technologies. So I come to the point for which I've been asked to deliver some thought. My general thesis is that we are living today a cooperative moment. This is a strong assertion. I know that. So I have to justify this assertion somewhat. And to do that, I have 4 arguments. In other words, 4 basic reasons for which we need to strengthen the cooperative movement, and at the same time, we can conjecture that in the future, near or far away, we will observe a re-emergence of cooperative firms in different parts of the world. The first argument has to do with the fact that common and wise people are realizing that the cooperative principle needs to be reinforced in view of the fact that the competitive principle is generating too many disasters and problems. As you know, humanity always, since right from the beginning, had to face 2 basic principles: the cooperative principles and the competitive principles. We need both of them. But what happened in the last few decades, 50, 60 years, since the last 50 or 60 years, that the competitive principles has, so to speak, overtaken and put on aside the cooperative principle. And that is what is called a confrontational competition, which is dangerous. Nowadays, everybody is prepared to bet on the fact that the neoliberal ideology has been the major cause of what I have described. Consider globalization. Globalization per se is a good thing. Nobody denies. But what happened in the last 2 or 3 decades? That globalization has been transformed into globalism. And globalism is not a good thing, as we are observing if we are careful enough in reading the novelties of this historical period. And why globalization transformed endogenously into globalism? For the reason I just mentioned, that too much attention has been given to competition. But if competition is not counterbalanced by cooperation, not so much by government, there is nothing. I know that there are certain people who say only government can counterbalance excessive competition. Of course, governments have a lot to do, but that is not enough because we need to put into equilibrium all the competitive principle with the other principle. This is the first reason. The second reason to explain why we are living a cooperative movement is the emergence of the notion of decent work. As you know, work has two dimensions, what is called the acquisitive dimension and expressive dimension. Acquisitive dimension means that by means of work, we, each one of us, acquire a purchasing power with which to buy the necessity of life. To this dimension corresponds the notion of just work, or justice in work. A work is considered just when it offers to the person, to the working person, the purchasing power which is sufficient to sustain himself and the members of the family. But then there is also the second dimension, which has been forgotten in the last half a century, namely the expressive dimension. And what does it mean, expressive? It means that we human beings express our identity. We realize our human potential by means and through work. To this dimension corresponds the notion of decent work. So a work can be just but not decent. That is the problem nowadays in our society, Canada as well as the United States, as well as Italy, Germany, etc., etc. Now, what is the sign, the actual sign to convince people who do not believe to that? The phenomenon which has been called a few years ago in America, Great Resignation. You know that in 1 year and a half, 2021 to 2022, in the United States, 42 million workers left voluntarily their job. But not because they did not have a contract. They were even paid. They were paid regularly. So they did not leave the job for reasons of justice, but for reasons of decency. And a work is not decent when the work humiliates the personality of the worker, when the working conditions do not allow per each one to, as I said before, to flourish. That is the technical word, flourishing, etc. So that is why, in fact, the International Labour Office, which is a United Nations special agency located in Geneva, last June organized its World Congress on the following title, The Decent Work. And that was the first time in 70 years since International Labour Office was created that the focus of attention was put on decent rather than on just work. Of course, we should continue to fight to have just even more justice in work. That is no question. What I'm saying, we needed to pay attention to the other dimension. And that is why what a cooperative firm is doing, actually, not should do, but is actually doing, at least for the knowledge that we have of the cooperative firms in our country, and in particular in our region, which is called Emilia-Romagna. So, because just to be frank, people are getting fed up to spend two-thirds of their life working in a place where they are humiliated. That is the point. Third argument has to do with the democratic principle. Now, we know that today, in our countries, in particular in the Western world countries, the democratic principle is in trouble. There is a crisis of democracy. And I have no time to explain or to tell the facts, but I take it that everybody knows them, etc. Now, what we keep on forgetting, and is that cooperation is not the only, but the major factor to implement the democratic rules. Because as we know, what is the basic rule of self-government? One head, one vote. One member, one vote. That is a famous principle which was introduced at the middle of the 19th century by John Stuart Mill, a great economist as well as an important philosopher, British. One head, one vote. Now, this democratic principle today is in trouble. Let me remind you what Albert Gallatin was one of the signatories of the Independence Declaration of the United States in 1776. Well, in 1795, he addressed the American Congress with these words, I quote by heart. Dear colleagues, let us remember that the democracy on which this nation has been established depends not only on the political rule, but also on the economic. Unless we have a truly democracy in the economic area, we run the risk of forgetting our democracy in the political arena. So this is the third reason why we need to pay attention to this aspect. Because the capitalistic firm, I know that some people do not like to listen to these things, but the capitalistic firm is anti-democratic, even though it operates in a country which, from a political point of view, it's democratic. Because within the capitalistic rule, who commands? Tell me. Those who are the owner of the capital. And the workers have to obey. That is the point. And so, if we really want to strengthen our democratic rule or mentality or culture, we need to pay attention to the economic infrastructure of our society. Finally, a fourth argument to support my basic claim has to do with the hot issue, namely inequalities. Now, in all our countries, inequalities are increasing. First of all, let us not confuse inequality with poverty. These are, perhaps the fault is of the economists, because they do not study enough and they keep on repeating to their students wrong things. Poverty is one thing. Inequality is something different. Poverty it's a matter of wealth, and wealth is a stock concept. Inequality is a matter of income, and income is a flow category or concept. So you can never confuse a flow magnitude with a stock magnitude. What is true is that poverty is declining, even though I would prefer at a more, let's say, rapid, higher speed. But it is honest to say that in the last 30, 35 years, poverty all over the world is in decline. On the other hand, and that is a paradox, inequality is increasing. And that is the question. Why is that so? Because paradox, it's a Greek word, which means a surprise, something that you did not expect. Because we observe that at the world level, wealth and income is increasing. But at the same time, inequalities, which measure the distance, measured by the Gini coefficient, between the different groups of people, instead of decreasing, increases. In the last 40 years, we know the famous book by Milanovic and the elephant curve, which has become famous all over the world, because describes exactly the phenomena under consideration. So what is the meaning of what I'm saying? That redistribution of income is not enough. Redistribution is necessary, but not sufficient. If we want to really to decrease inequalities, which is something very dangerous, even from many different, not only from an ethical point of view, but also from a political point of view, redistribution is not enough. Redistribution was enough until 40 years ago, but not now, because inequalities are too excessive. What we need is a pre-distribution. In other words, we need to modify the rules of access to the labor market of people before they start the productive process. And that is why we need more cooperatives. So, to conclude, because time is, I've been given only 15 minutes, and so I have to respect the rules. These are the four basic reasons why we can expect in the near future a resurgence, so to speak, a new wave of cooperative enterprise. Different. The spirit is the same. The forms are different from the original wave which started, as you know, in the middle of the 19th century, first in England, States, and elsewhere in other countries. In the last few minutes I have left, what arguments or which message should we offer political leaders if they really want to be serious people in order to support this, what I just said? Three things. First of all, compensation for the common goods. Because you see, cooperative firms generates common goods. Because if cooperatives are able to diminish inequalities, that is a common good. Another example of a common good is democracy. Democracy is a common good. It's not a private good. It's not a public good. Because these are technical names. One has to be careful in not misusing them. So if cooperative generates common goods which benefit the whole society, a government or a political authority, whatever, should compensate in one form or another. Because as you know, private goods receive their compensation in the market, but common goods, by definition, do not participate to the market. So you have a case of where certain subject agents generate common goods and they receive no compensation. Second, proportionality rule. What does it mean? It means that an authority, which is a responsible authority, cannot apply to the cooperative movement exactly the same rules which have been devised for the capitalistic firms. Those who claim that are horrible people. First of all, are stupid because they do not know the literature. Because already Aristotle in ancient Greece said that you cannot apply the same rules to people who are diverse. That is a famous dictum also in Latin. In other words, the rules have to take into consideration the nature of the agents who or which are operating in a particular setup. That is what we have to ask. We in Europe, European Union, after a couple of years of strong battles, we have been able to obtain the European Parliament exactly this principle, proportionality rule. Finally, we should ask our governors to invest in culture. Culture, not to be confused with instruction. Instruction is something very important, no doubt, but culture is something else. Culture is an organized system of values, but cultures do not come down from the sky, like the rain. You need to make investment in culture. What we observe in our countries, more or less, of course, there are differences. Italy, from this point of view, is in a bad shape. There are sufficient investment in instruction, but no investment in culture. For instance, one way, just to give you an example, investment of culture, to have access in the schools and above all university to allow people, young people, to know about the cooperative movement. Of course, there are exceptions. As Elvi mentioned before, Bologna University was the first in this country, in my country, to introduce a university degree in cooperative studies. And after that, other universities follow suit. The same, this is only an example. What we should ask the regional government in particular to dedicate part of the available resources to invest in high culture. Because without a place where a thought is produced, there is no future. Be careful. Thought is of two types. There is a thinking thought and calculating thought. We have enough calculating thought. What we are lacking is a thinking thought. That is my wish, and let me take this opportunity to wish all of you a good stay, and hopefully I would be happy to see you some way in Bologna if that is possible. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stefano. I'm sure there'll be some. I'm sure there are questions. I certainly have some questions, but first, we're going to hear from Vera Zamagni, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Vera?
Okay, thank you very much. My role is to try and make some examples of how to allow cooperative firms to become more solid and to be able to compete, because actually cooperative firms live inside a competitive environment. No? The major problem of cooperatives for competing with capitalist firms is the lack of enough capital. So one way of approaching the aim of consolidating cooperatives is to promote a legislation that allows higher capitalization of co-ops. Now, some examples from Emilia-Romagna. Elvi knows this very well because, of course, in his study tours, I have been clarifying at this point, but the audience has not participated into the study tours, so maybe these examples will help understanding. One instrument has been that of the so-called indivisible reserves, namely Italian cooperatives and Emilia-Romagna especially are allowed to set aside some of the profits, or even for past periods, 100% of the profits, rather than distributing them to the members, are allowed to set aside these profits to the capital called the reserves of the cooperative itself, without paying corporate tax. So the legislation grants not a direct subsidy, but the possibility to increase the capital of the cooperative, but this capital can never be distributed back to the members. And for this reason, they are called indivisible reserves, because they cannot be distributed to members anytime. Even if the cooperative will be liquidated at some point of time, this capital will be set aside for the umbrella organizations, and we come to the umbrella organization in a minute, to use for the strengthening of the cooperative movement. Now, this has capitalized a lot of Italian cooperatives, but other instruments could be used, like, for instance, member loans, because members contribute a little amount of the share capital of the cooperative, but could be allowed also to make loans to the cooperative. And in this case, the loans will be repaid when, according to the contract, is the time to do so. But in the meantime, the cooperative can use this loan for investments, specific investments in its own activity, increasing obviously the possibility to strengthen the cooperative. But even, and this is something which is rather special in the context of cooperation at the world level, Italian cooperatives are allowed to either put in place or buy a joint stock company that they could control. And this for the purpose of collecting additional capital from the normal sources that are available to joint stock companies, because there is no a social stock exchange. This is a project that Stefano has been produced back in time, but at the moment has not gone anywhere, of having another stock exchange devoted to capital of cooperatives, but not having been translated this idea into operation. So one way of allowing cooperatives to get more capital is to allow the cooperatives to own, control joint stock companies. In a number of cases in Italy, this has been extremely useful and powerful because, for instance, our second insurance company in Italy is a company that is controlled by cooperatives, which was put in place by cooperatives back in time, and it is now controlled by cooperatives, but it is a joint stock company. And in this particular case, which is the only case, is even quoted in the stock exchange, in the normal stock exchange, but still, even today, controlled by cooperatives. You realize that having the possibility by part of cooperatives to use this extremely large insurance company for the purposes that are useful for the strengthening of the cooperative movement has been a great addition. Always with the purpose of allowing cooperatives, not so much in this case to increase capital, but to increase the possibility of having a size good enough in fact to compete with large joint stock companies without merging, no? The idea was to allow these cooperatives to join for particular reasons, for instance, to be able to participate into public or private tenders in so-called consortia, no? Consortia which are allowed to take part in these tenders on behalf of the cooperatives that form this consortium. So they can certainly participate into much larger kind of activity that will not be available to the single cooperative. Also, and this is a third important addition, always in the direction of strengthening cooperatives, but in this case, not in terms of capital or in terms of size, but in terms of strategy. No? The umbrella organizations in Italy are allowed not only to give services to cooperatives, which is normal generally in the world, but also to run a fund which can be used for strategic purposes of reorganizing existing cooperatives or starting new cooperatives. And this fund, in the Italian case, is funded by the cooperatives themselves, which pay 3% of their profits to the fund, no? And this fund is managed by the umbrella organizations precisely for the purposes that I mentioned. One final aspect I would like to mention in this context of the actual instruments that are used in Emilia-Romagna and in Italy in general, but the success in Emilia-Romagna is larger, and I will have a comment in my final intervention, is that the cooperatives are pretty ready to cooperate with small size and particularly small size sort of normal companies, limited companies, in many of the sectors in which the cooperatives work. So there is an alliance, in fact, and also the possibility to make exchange, because one of the principles of the International Cooperative Alliance is that of cooperation among cooperatives. Now, in Emilia-Romagna especially, this has been enlarged including in this cooperation among firms, not only cooperatives, but also small size firms. And this enlarges the impact that the mentality of cooperation can make, no? And does not leave cooperatives isolated into society, no? But there are exchanges all the time between the cooperative side and those companies that are ready to collaborate. Because, I mean, if you run a small company, limited company, if you run a small limited company, you cannot do alone, no? And so there is a propensity to collaborate, and this is strengthened by the fact that the cooperatives, in fact, give an end to this. A couple of final comments are the following. First, on the fact that some of the Emilia-Romagna cooperatives have become large. And it was, in a way, somehow inevitable that this would be so. But we cannot, in fact, imagine that cooperatives have to be limited to small size. And of course, in Emilia-Romagna, this was never considered, this idea that I know that in other contexts instead has popped up, namely that cooperatives, to work as cooperatives, they have to remain small. But of course, we must admit that when cooperatives become large, even in Emilia-Romagna, they are not the best examples of cooperative identity, no? And this has to do with what Stefano lately mentioned, namely that the cooperative movement, not even in Emilia-Romagna, has succeeded in understanding that there is a need to develop a cooperative culture. And therefore, the managers that are appointed in these large cooperatives come from schools of management that are organized around the capitalist approach. And when they are transferred into the cooperatives, they, in a way, do not interpret really the identity of the cooperatives. Is a problem which quite open yet, but is key to have the possibility to allow cooperatives to become larger, because otherwise, no, in a way, it is better what many colleagues say, that cooperatives should remain small because otherwise they lose their identity. No, this is not necessary, no, by all means, no, but they can keep the identity if they have a group of managers that are understanding exactly what managing a cooperative means, because to manage a cooperative is more difficult than to manage a capitalist enterprise. No? This must be said quite clearly, no? Because managing a capitalist enterprise is only one single aim: to increase the profits for the shareholders. So this is the only aim that they have. No? But instead, as you all know, I mean, this could not be certainly the aim of cooperatives, and therefore, at the same time, they have to keep cooperatives viable from a purely financial point of view, but at the same time, they have to put in place all the social aspects that cooperation entails. No? So this is really a question. My second final comment is the following. It is obvious that Emilia-Romagna has enjoyed of a situation which is not easily found in Anglo-Saxon countries. Maybe Canada is the best among the Anglo-Saxon countries, but still belongs to it. You know? Namely, the fact that people in Emilia-Romagna and in many other parts of Italy, I would say, you know, but mostly in Emilia-Romagna, have always liked to work in a relational context. No? Family firms are extremely widespread. No? Big business mostly are state big business, but no private big business exists in Emilia-Romagna, which means that the idea of relating each other with others and not being willing to become monopolist and to desertify the market of other competitors, no, this idea has never been present, no? Because if you are small and medium size, you know that you must cooperate with someone else, because in many ways you depend, the success of your firm depends on the intermediate goods, the relations that you have with all other firms. No? And of course, cooperatives do this by definition, but also other firms which are small and medium size go in this direction. So there is a cooperative mentality around, and I must admit that this is not the case in general in Anglo-Saxon countries, where then instead the competition of very large corporations tend to desertify the market of other competitors and tend to become quasi-monopolist, because of course we all have antitrust legislation, although at the moment this antitrust legislation is not working very well. if we have to look at the quasi-monopolist of the platforms at the world level, you know, but in any case, no, although not maybe monopoly, but certainly large hierarchical corporations that do not allow the voice to communities and to workers and so on. So I wanted to tell you this, you know, because otherwise I would not be fair with the Anglo-Saxon world, that is much more difficult in terms of developing a healthy and large cooperative movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vera. After 16 study tours to Italy, and as I tell people, it's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it. I really miss Stefano and Vera. I really miss having a couple of weeks with them and filling my head with all kinds of wonderful, and filling my heart with all kinds of wonderful thoughts about where we could go to a happier place in our economy. Maybe there are some questions from the floor, and we have a roving mic to do the Phil Donahue thing, at the risk of dating myself. Questions?
Yeah, you both touched on something that really preoccupies me, and that is that the sort of cooperative spirit in larger co-ops, and how often they will demonstrate, cooperative values in what you referred to as the, redistribution sort of tail end. So they have, profit or excess capital that has been accumulated, and it's contributed back into the community into all kinds of wonderful things. But maybe there isn't the embodiment of, you talked about things like income inequality. There isn't folks who are the managerial leaders of these organizations, and they don't necessarily embody those cooperative pieces kind of at that end of the organization. And I wonder if you have advice on how you maintain these thriving large organizations that require certain kinds of people to run them, but at the same time, are not just at the tail end interested in redistribution, but in really embodying things like income inequality and living those values.
Can you tell me your name? Because otherwise, how can I possibly answer?
Oh.
Just a name, just the
Christy.
first name.
Christy.
50. Okay, thank you. Should we answer one at a time, or should we listen to other questions, grouping them in 3 or 4 of them? I don't know your habit.
Sure. No, we'll collect a few more questions.
Yes.
Hi, Stefano and Vera. My name's Dara. I was able to come to Italy with you in 2019, so I enjoyed your talks back then. I do have a question about what Vera just was talking about, the monopolistic attitude. And I mean, when I'm listening, I'm hearing that that's a challenge, but I'm not sure. I hear that that's a barrier that may need to be overcome. And I wonder, is that connected to, I mean, to me, it sounds like it's a cultural barrier, because it's sort of this assumption in society that monopolies are in alignment with that capitalistic attitude of, the winner takes all kind of attitude. So yeah, just a question about that.
Thanks. Ada?
Hi, my name's Magda. I had a question. I'm a student, so I'm learning lots about cooperatives right now, but there was mention of allowing co-ops to control some forms of capital, and not for capital raising's sake, but for advancing the mission of cooperatives, increasing social goods. And I believe, Vera, you gave the example of insurance, I believe it was. But I'm curious, given that co-ops are ultimately run by people, and people are not always rational and sort of prone to fallacy, how do we ensure that cooperatives are able to achieve their, like, the theoretical idea of what they embody, as opposed to what in practice they can actually accomplish? And I think that kind of speaks to leadership capacity, and how do we overcome human error. And yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just
Thanks.
going to ask one more question, if that's okay. It's Am here, Stefano Vera. I was in Bologna in 2007. I think some of the new energy in the co-op movement is sort of something beyond the Anglo-Saxon or Western side of Canada. Is that, out in the suburbs in Surrey, we have refugee newcomer communities launching new co-ops. And I'm wondering if you could speak in the Italian or Emilia-Romagna region of immigrant or refugee communities and their connection to the co-op sector.
Okay. Any other?
We can start
I think
with
we
these.
can start with these, and then there'll be
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Stefano. Start with the first two. Maybe I answer the other.
Yes, I think I have to answer to the first and to the third, because the second question was directed to you, Vera.
Yeah.
Let me answer the two, the first and the third question, jointly, because in a sense, although in a different way, they overlap. And my answer is the following. We should never forget that the cooperative is an hybrid organization. That is the typical mistake that, in particular, certain scholars pertaining to certain school of thought keep on making. What does it mean that cooperative is a hybrid organization? It means that it's an organization that integrates three institutional logics. The economic logic that relates to the fact that co-ops produce goods and services. They are sold in the market and thus need to be financially viable. Second, the democratic logic, what I was saying before. Third, the social logic. Social logic is based on the principle of reciprocity inside the cooperative self and outside of it. These three characteristics are not present in the capitalistic firm, because the capitalistic firm has only one logic, which is the economic logic. That is why to run a capitalistic firm is very easy. Very easy, believe me. Don't believe those people who say, oh, no. It's easy because they have only one logic. To run, on the other hand, a cooperative firm, of course, provided that is of a certain size, it becomes difficult. Because the problem is how to harmonize three logics which are completely different, one from the other. And that is why I, in the last part of my presentation before, I insisted on in making specific investment in cooperative culture. That is what I meant. In other words, to be concrete, the question is what should be the governance code for a cooperative which has the characteristic I was talking about. Now, what has to be said, honestly, is that today we do not have at our disposal such a theory telling us the characteristics of a governance code to harmonize the three logics. And what is the result? That in certain cases, certain cooperatives, because the founder, the president, the most outstanding person tends to, in one way or the other, to keep a balance, to strike a balance between the three logics. But as I said, from a theoretical point of view, if somebody asks us, give me a governance code, we cannot. We can only say, look what happens in that case, what that particular subject did, etc., etc. In other words, we can inform them about experiences, but we do not have yet a theory to solve the problem I raised. And that is why that in reality, when we come at the end of the day, I have to admit that the economic logic tends to dominate the other two. because, as you know, the rules of the market are what they are. And so in order to be financially or economically viable, the board of that particular cooperative tends to say, we know that that is not completely correct, but we have no other alternative. Now, to conclude on that, what I have to say is it does exist a way to achieve a compatibility or, as I said, harmonization of the three logics. But it is not something which we can find in nature. We have to study. That is why I keep on insisting on investment in very high culture. Because you see, the three logics are not the same in terms of cultural background. Because economic logic is different from the democratic logic. Because for the democratic logic, you need political sciences. You need to be an expert in politics. In the same way, the social logic, you need to be expert in certain sociological issues. That is why we need a major effort in this regard. The question which was raised by the last, I forgot now to write the name, who intervened, it's about the refugee question. That is, in particular, in these days, in this country, a hot question. I'm sure that you read in the newspaper what is happening, because the Mediterranean Sea has become the major area of contracts and of migrants flows at the world level. The point is the following, that we have been able to solve the problems of acceptation, to accept of these people. But we do not have yet a model of integration. In other words, it's not enough when the migrants or the refugees come to our border to say, we provide for you food, garments, medicine according to the case. Because that is the first stage, the emergency stage. But what we need is what type of model of integration do we want to implement? As you know, Canada was the first country in the world to apply a particular model, which nowadays does not work any longer. Not for the fault of the Canadians, because the situation has changed. In the same way, that is called a multicultural model. Now, the multicultural model does not work. That is what we have to. I have no time to explain why, but those who follow these events, there is a huge literature showing that. The opposing model was coined in France, and it is called the integrationist model. Again, that does not work in there. So we find ourselves, I mean the Western world, in this situation, that the two historical models, the multicultural models and the integrationist model, today have become obsolete. And so we have to strive to find a new model. Otherwise, the problems that we keep on reading on the newspapers every day will not be solved. In this connection, I would like to conclude by saying that the cooperative form of, because you see, so far we have been talking about the cooperative enterprises, but nowadays we have many different examples where the cooperative principle is, for instance, in Italy, we have today a lot of community cooperatives, which are different from cooperative enterprises, etc. So I have reasons to believe that even facing the problem of the refugees and migrants integration, the cooperative model, or better to say, the cooperative principle, might represent a way out of the difficulties.
Yes, I might add something that go in the direction of answering the questions. And my first point is the following. Capitalists themselves are realizing in these days that the exclusive interest by the part of capitalist corporations on the economic aspect, which we mentioned before, no shareholder value and maximization of profits for shareholders, is not acceptable anymore. And they are trying to produce a number of modifications to that model. In August 2019, 180 CEO of the major American corporations, including some of the most capitalist really, produced, as I said, a manifesto saying that enough with the shareholder value, we must move to the stakeholder value, no? In which all components of the process of production are taken into consideration, and not only the shareholders, which means that really, as Stefano was saying at the beginning, we have an opportunity for cooperatives today, because even the capitalists realize that they cannot go along with the same views as before. We have not seen much of a change in the administration of the major world corporation, American corporations, ever since they have produced this manifesto. But at the very least, they show some uneasiness in front of the approach that they had been so far. No? But also, we must acknowledge the existence of the B Corp. Maybe you know this. We have in Italy a version of the B Corp called benefits companies, benefit companies, yes. And also an effort, at least in Italy, I don't know whether in Canada you have similar thing, of the so-called second welfare, namely capitalist companies that produce additional benefits to their workers, additional to the salary and the wages, de-taxed by the state. No? So we would like to see a capability by the part of cooperatives to take this opportunity in this connection, and not in a way being robbed of this opportunity by the same capitalist corporations that try to meet the new requests and the new needs that are expressed by society. In terms of whether or not, I answer the third question, whether or not then these joint stock companies, which are controlled by cooperatives, work for the purpose of cooperatives and not falling back to normal capitalist behavior. We must say that, again, is not a settled affair, no, but certainly in a way they cannot openly work against the cooperative principles at the very least, which is already something, I would say, in front of the uncontrolled capitalism that we have had in recent times. And in terms of new COPs, somebody was suggesting done by refugee or migrants. We have to take into account that in the case of Italy, a very large amount of these migrants are extremely young people, even minors, people not of age, because families from Africa or other places amass only enough money to send these young people unaccompanied. So this is it's impossible, of course, to imagine that they would participating into any entrepreneurial type of activity themselves. So we have a major burden in trying to instruct them, to educate them, and so on and so forth, which adds to what Stefano was saying in terms of problems of integration. And finally, this tendency to monopolization of capitalism in present time is connected with what Stefano was mentioning in terms of globalism, no? Because these transnationals do not respond any longer to national legislation, no? And there should be the development of an international, really global, if you like, legislation in terms of stopping the tendency to monopoly, something that has not taken place yet. No? So we are living in very difficult times from this point of view. And at the very least, we have the European Union that tries, at the very least, no, to make them pay some taxes, because no, not even this they do. No? Okay.
Other question?
More questions?
Even related to other topics, not necessarily to what we have been saying so far.
Well,
Please.
something they were not said.
We believe in freedom, and so everybody should feel free.
I have a question. My name is Mario. My question is about democracy in co-ops and voter turnout. So in North America, it's common to see turnouts between 5–10%, uncommon to see much higher than that. What's the situation like in Emilia-Romagna, and how do you interpret this this fact about cooperatives? In civic elections, when we have turnouts below 50%, I notice a kind of panic about the state of democracy and whether we're losing it. But in cooperatives, it seems normal to have an order of magnitude less, and yet it's not something I see discussed. So how do you interpret this fact, and what's the Italian situation?
May I answer, Stefano? Maybe we collect.
No, let's see whether there are other questions.
Yes.
Hello? Oh, okay, great. Hello, my name is Eva. I also work for the BC Cooperative Association. I was very interested in your comment, I believe it was Vera, speaking about the compensation for the common good. It might have been Stefano.
No, it was Stefano.
Sorry, Stefano. And it got me thinking about the question of who compensates for the common good. Is it in a way, is there a role for like the state to be compensating the cooperative sector for the creation of common good? Is that relationship defined in Emilia-Romagna? And can you maybe comment on the nature of the relationship between the state and the cooperative sector?
Thank you. Other?
Hello, this is my name is Chris. Thank you to you both. My question, and sorry if it's a very simple one or obvious. I wonder if or what both of your thoughts are on, is a wholesale crash of current economic political systems really the best opportunity for the co-op, for co-ops, or is there still an opportunity for co-ops to thrive in circumstances that are less dramatic?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Kevin, and my question is, we're seeing a lot of heightened impacts from the climate crisis and other forms of ecological breakdown and stress. Do you see work on, you talked about the three core logics. Is there an ecological logic that needs to be added to those three, or do you see the role of ecology, or how do you see the role of ecology impacting how we think about the cooperative principles and the cooperative endeavor?
Thank you. Very important question.
That's a lot of questions, but I'll go next. My name is Ali. I'm doing my PhD in economics, and I also working for a labor union. So my question is about the tension that exists between retail or consumer co-ops and how they treat their workers. We've seen right locally here cooperatives like the infamous MEC, Mountain Equipment Co-op, that actively ran a vicious anti-union campaign against its workers who were trying to organize for better conditions. So unfortunately, we know that there are many cooperatives operating like Otter Co-op or other, kind of regular consumer co-ops that do not necessarily treat their workforce with respect or able to even allow them to collectively organize and bargain. So how do we negotiate that tension? And I really appreciate your comments around regulatory systems that allow for the accumulation of capital for furthering the cooperative model. And would there be a way that we could implement a similar system to also regulate the way that cooperatives must treat their staff, their workers, and those that are creating value in the same way that we regulate financialization?
Yeah.
Okay, Vera, you go first now.
Yes, I go first, and I answer the first two questions. First, democracy. It is obvious that in large co-ops, there are always problems, because we have a large retail co-op that has 2.5 million members, so. But they try to cope with this with local assemblies. So in all the places in which they have local assemblies, and they could do better. But in a way, it's the problem of the big co-op. But in Emilia-Romagna and in Italy in general, we do not have so many big co-ops. We have mostly small and medium-sized co-ops, and in that case, democracy is easier, I would say, because there is a large participation in general in workers' co-ops or in farmers' co-ops or in social co-ops. So democracy is a major problem for big co-ops, but not for the others. And the second question was asking about compensation for the common good. Now, you have to understand that Italy is the only country in the world that has cooperation in constitution. We have an article of our constitution, Article 45, that says that the state is obliged to promote cooperation and with the instruments that will be devised according to the various periods of time. So there is the need of legislation to put in practice the principle that is written in the article. So in a way, we had, after the end of the Second World War and the major problems that we had with fascism, the understanding that it was necessary to have solid social dimensions inside our constitution in all the articles connected with the economy. Also, other articles connected with the economy were very socially devised, organized. So it's not only that on cooperatives. But in any case, the one on cooperatives has made inevitable for any type of government of all sides, left or right or center government, to produce a legislation favorable for the cooperatives. So this is an important point. It must be made clear at the high level that this point of compensation is necessary, because cooperatives perform all the roles that Stefano was listing, which are roles extremely important for a society to flourish. And therefore, and also it makes clear that cooperatives must be treated separately, or for the features that they have themselves and are not the same features of the capitalist system. As Stefano said, the proportionality principle. No? So this has been made clear in our constitution and has been, in fact, put in place. Not always in the best possible way, but I mean, was always considered. And if you do not have this understanding on top, then it becomes difficult to act, to put this idea of compensation for the common good into practice. I leave to Stefano the others.
Thank you. Let me remark on the question of democracy. Now, we tend to identify the democratic principle with the majoritarian rule or the voting rule. That is a mistake, because voting rules have nothing to do with democracy. Even in Soviet Union, they had voting rules, but nobody could say that it was a democratic country. Even in China nowadays, they have voting rules. What is typical of the democratic principle, which was born 2,300 years ago in ancient Greece, in Athens, is the deliberative method. That is what identifies democracy. So it is obvious that you can have an assembly where you put to the vote a certain issue or certain question, but that has nothing to do with democracy. And it is ridiculous. Deliberation is what is needed. That is why the cooperative firm is a truly democratic firm. The other firms are not democratic for this reason, because in a true cooperative enterprise, I said that it's true because, of course, there are, as we know, false cooperative enterprises. They apply the deliberative. I don't know if you know this expression, but the literature on deliberative democracy is immense, immense. If you digit in Google or whatever, deliberative democracy, you obtain a list of thousands, books, articles, conferences, etc., etc. Second question, compensation. The point, what Vera said, is particularly true for Italy, because Italy is the only country in the world which has in its constitution a special recognition for the cooperative firms. And so that is correct. But apart from that, what is the general principle? That anybody who generates value must be compensated. That is the fundamental principle valid all over the world. Now, if the agent produces, as I said before, private goods, the value which has been created passes through the market. And so the compensation becomes a revenue. If you sell something, you get a revenue. But when an agent generates a common good like environment or ecology, and I come to that later, it is obvious that does not pass through the market. And so unless you find ways of compensation which do not necessarily need to be monetary, no, could be monetary, but not only, could be, for instance, fiscal, etc., you have a terrible inequity in the society, because you have agents who generates common goods which benefits the whole society, the whole community, and they get nothing. That cannot be tolerated. That is an injustice. Okay? In the case, I repeat, of capitalistic firm, there is no problem, because they produce and they sell. And so in selling, they obtain their compensation. And that is okay. But in the case of cooperatives, which generates something which is not object of exchanges, market exchanges, there is a problem. Finally, the question of ecology. Yes, that is an important point. Now, I don't know if you know the book by Elinor Ostrom, published in 1990. Elinor Ostrom was an American US political scientist, and she obtained later, in the year 2004, the Nobel Prize in Economics, even though, or because she was not an economist. Because economists are stubborn. It's a disaster, apart from few exceptions. Because they pretend to treat ecology, environment, etc., as if they were public goods. No, they are common goods. Now, if you read the book by Elinor Ostrom, whose title is Governing the Commons, that is the title of the book, which has been translated to all languages of the world, she explicitly writes that the only way for solving and governing the ecological issue is to adopt the cooperative model of organization. Full stop. And since she's not an economist, she arrived at that out of her experience in different parts of the world and of Israel. So that is why I expect in the near future cooperatives to re-emerge. Because since our environment, our, let's say, health, air, water, pollution, CO2, etc., there is, sooner or later, people will get convinced that the only way is to move in the direction, not necessarily of cooperative firms. I said a cooperative mode of production. Finally, the question of the final question was how cooperatives should treat workers, etc., etc. Yes. In Italy, in the year 2002, last year, 2022, 1,600,000 workers left voluntarily their job for the reason I mentioned before. Do you have to say 42 million? I don't know. I do not have the statistics of Canada. But out of these 1,600,000 people in Italy, not one was working in a cooperative firm. Now, tell me the reasons. That is the best way to answer that question. Because the cooperative firm, of course, there are differences between one and the other, but in general, they have on the top of their statute the idea of making work a decent activity. Decent work, not only just work. Because justice in work can be achieved also by capitalistic firms. And that is a good point. But it's very difficult unless, of course, miracles are always possible if you believe in miracles, but in general, a capitalistic firm is unable to obtain a decent work. Now, I have no time to explain the reasons, but apart from very few exceptions, in Italy, one exception is always quoted, Olivetti. Olivetti was a capitalistic firm which already in the early 50s of last century applied the cooperative model. Not the form, the juridical form, but the spirit of cooperative. And in fact, nobody wanted to leave that factory. There must be a reason. So to conclude, thank you very much for your question. And it's a pity that we have to stop here because that is what were the instructions. And we really hope to have you, at least some of you, a delegation to Bologna, and you will be mostly welcomed to us. Okay? So thank you very much, and have a nice day, and also the next few days. Thank you.
Also from my part.
Vera, Stefano, thank you very much for enlightening us and for taking the time to talk. And I look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
Okay. We have been very pleased to chat with you.
Okay. Good. All the best. Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao, Thomas.